December 14, 1886, Wyoming Territory. Silas Vaughan had seen 30 winters on these plains, and he knew what death looked like. Through the brass telescope, he watched the thin column of smoke rising from Willa Thorne's cabin 3 miles distant, barely visible through the thinning curtain of snow. The blizzard had finally broken after 3 days of biblical fury. 3 days that had killed 43 of his cattle and reduced his fence windbreak to splinters. And that fool woman had been out there alone with 2 small children, protected by nothing but a circle of saplings she'd planted in the fall. Saplings. Against a storm that had just rewritten the landscape of the entire territory. She couldn't have survived, he muttered to himself, lowering the telescope. His hands were shaking not from cold but from the weight of what he'd done, or rather what he'd failed to do. He'd offered to take her and the children to his ranch before the storm hit. She refused, politely, firmly, with that quiet certainty that had both impressed and infuriated him. "We'll weather this at home, Mr. Vaughan." Stubborn woman, brilliant, stubborn, doomed woman. The smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was alive to tend it, but that was impossible. Silas pulled on his heavy coat and called for his horse. He had to know, he had to see with his own eyes what remained of the widow who dared to tell him, a man with 3 decades of ranching experience, that he didn't understand the wind. 4 months earlier, everything had been different. The day they buried Robert Thorne, the wind had been gentle, almost mocking in its softness. September in Wyoming could be deceptive that way. Warm sun, blue skies, grass still green along the creek beds. A man could almost forget that winter was a predator, patient and inevitable, waiting just beyond the horizon. Willa Thorne stood at the graveside in a black dress that had belonged to her mother. It hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight in the 2 weeks since the accident. Her face was pale, composed, empty of tears. Her hands rested on the shoulders of her 2 children. Nathaniel, 7 years old, stood rigid and silent. Beatrice, 5, clutched a wilted sunflower and didn't seem to understand why everyone was so quiet. The preacher spoke words about dust and resurrection. Silas Vaughan stood at the back of the small gathering, hat in hand, and watched the widow's face. He'd known Robert Thorne, not well but enough. A capable man, strong, hard-working. The kind of neighbor you could count on when a fence needed mending or a barn raising required extra hands. Dead at 35 because an oak tree fell on him during a windstorm. Silas had seen the tree afterward. Massive old thing, roots half exposed from years of erosion. Robert had been cutting it down, trying to clear space for a better hay field. The wind had come up sudden, as it often did on these plains, and the tree had fallen the wrong way. Crushed him instantly. They said he'd lingered for an hour before he died. Long enough to be carried back to the cabin. Long enough to say goodbye to his wife and children. Long enough to fill a man's mind with regrets. After the burial, the neighbors gathered at the cabin. There was food. There was always food at these things. Casseroles and pies and bread still warm from someone's oven. The women clustered around Willa, offering condolences and practical advice in equal measure. The men stood outside, smoking pipes, talking in low voices about the harvest and the coming winter and the foolishness of trying to take down a tree that size alone. Silas approached Willa as the afternoon sun began to slant golden through the cabin windows. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Robert was a good man." She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over distant mountains, dry, steady. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. If there's anything you need," he continued, "anything at all, you just send word. My ranch is only 3 miles west. I've got men who can help with repairs, with the stock, with whatever needs doing before winter sets in. That's kind of you." Her voice was quiet but firm, not the voice of a woman drowning in grief. The voice of someone already calculating, already planning. "I know Robert had some debt with the bank," Silas said carefully. "And I know winter doesn't care about a man's circumstances. If you're thinking of selling the homestead, I'd be willing to make you a fair offer. Enough to settle accounts and set you up in town. It's no shame to it. A woman alone with 2 children, this land can be unforgiving." Willa's expression didn't change. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Vaughan, but I'm not selling. Mrs. Thorne, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but then don't. The words were soft but carried an edge like winter's steel. This is my home, my children's home. My husband died trying to make it work. I won't abandon it. Silas studied her for a long moment. He saw the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine, pride, determination, and something else he couldn't quite name. Intelligence, maybe, a kind of quiet confidence that had nothing to do with strength or stubbornness. As you wish, ma'am, he said finally and tipped his hat. He left thinking she'd change her mind before the first snow. He was wrong about many things that year. The cabin Robert Thorne had built stood alone on a slight rise, surrounded by open grassland that stretched in every direction like a frozen ocean. There was a small barn, a root cellar, a chicken coop, a well with a good rope and bucket, a vegetable garden now going to seed. 160 acres of homestead claim, most of it grazing land for the small herd of cattle that represented the family's only real asset, and absolutely no protection from the wind. Silas had noticed that the first time he'd visited years ago when Robert was still alive. The cabin sat exposed, vulnerable. The wind came down from the north in winter like a physical force, a thing with weight and malice. It found every crack in the walls, every gap in the door frame. It stole heat and moisture and hope. Robert had tried to address it. 2 years back, he'd built a windbreak, a solid fence of vertical planks, 8 feet high, running east to west, about 50 yards north of the cabin. It had seemed like a good idea, a solid wall to stop the wind. The first major storm had torn it to pieces. Robert had rebuilt it heavier, this time with posts sunk deeper. That one had lasted through one winter before collapsing. He had been planning to try again, different design, different materials. But then the oak tree had other plans. Now the broken remnants of the second windbreak lay scattered across the prairie like picket over bones. And Willa Thorne was alone with 2 children and a problem she'd inherited along with the land. 3 days after the funeral, Silas saw her in town at the general store. She was purchasing rope and burlap, counting out coins with careful precision. Her children stood close beside her, quiet and well-behaved. Mrs. Thorne, he greeted her. Mr. Vaughan, doing some preparations. He waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. Well, he said after a moment, if you need help with anything heavy, you know where to find me. I do, thank you. She gathered her purchases and left, and Silas stood there feeling oddly dismissed. Strange woman, said Marcus Webb, the store owner, watching her go. Robert's death hit her hard, I reckon. Heard she's been spending all her time drawing pictures and writing in journals. Some folks think the grief's touched her mind. Some folks talk too much, Silas replied mildly and left to collect his own supplies. But the comment stuck with him. 2 weeks later, Silas had reason to ride past the Thorne homestead on his way to check on some cattle in the eastern pasture. What he saw made him rein in his horse and stare. Willa Thorne was digging holes. Not just a few holes, dozens of them. They formed a pattern around the cabin, circles within circles like ripples in a pond. Each hole was maybe 2 feet across and equally deep. She worked with a spade and a pickaxe, her sleeves rolled up despite the October chill, her dark hair tied back with a simple ribbon. The boy Nathaniel was helping. He dragged the excavated dirt away in a small wooden bucket while his mother dug. The little girl sat on the cabin steps playing with corn husk dolls. Silas guided his horse closer. Willa looked up as he approached, wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, and waited. Mrs. Thorne, he said, might I ask what you're doing? Planting trees, Mr. Vaughan. He looked at the holes, then at the cabin, then back at her. Trees, he repeated. That's correct. Ma'am, with respect, winter's coming. You should be banking sod against the foundation, checking your chimney, stacking wood, not digging holes for trees. Willa set down her spade and faced him fully. There was dirt under her fingernails and a smudge of mud on her cheek, but her gaze was level and clear. I am preparing for winter, Mr. Vaughan, just not in the way you would. Trees take years to grow. he said, trying to keep his voice patient. You need protection now. A solid windbreak. I could send some of my men over, help you build a proper fence. My husband built two solid windbreaks, she interrupted quietly, but both failed. Both were destroyed by the very wind they were meant to stop. Because he didn't build them right, Silas countered. No offense to the dead, but Robert wasn't a carpenter. You need proper posts, proper bracing. You need proper understanding, Willa said, of how wind behaves. There was a long silence. Silas shifted in his saddle. Ma'am, I've ranched these plains for 30 years. I know how wind behaves. Do you? She picked up a stick and drew in the dirt at her feet. A simple diagram, a square, representing the cabin lines, representing wind. A solid wall does what exactly when wind hits it, stops it. No. She drew more lines showing wind flowing up and over, creating turbulence behind. It deflects it, the wind hits the wall, compresses, accelerates over the top, and creates violent turbulence on the lee side. The wind doesn't stop, it gets angry. Silas frowned at the diagram. But a porous screen, she continued, drawing dots to represent trees, breaks the wind into smaller currents. Each tree, each branch, each needle steals a tiny bit of the wind's energy. The wind doesn't hit a wall, it passes through a filter. By the time it reaches the cabin, it's exhausted, spent. And the snow it was carrying, she tapped the stick against the dots, falls here, among the trees, building a wall for me, a wall made by the wind itself. She looked up at him. My father was a forest surveyor in Vermont, Mr. Vaughan. He taught me to read landscapes the way you read cattle. I know what I'm doing. Silas looked at the diagram in the dirt, then at the holes arranged in their careful circles, then at this slight woman with dirt on her face and absolute certainty in her eyes. Mrs. Thorne, he said slowly, those saplings you're planning to plant, even if your theory is sound, they won't be big enough this winter to do what you're describing. They're too small, too young. They don't need to be large, she said. They need to be numerous and properly spaced. Density matters more than height for wind diffusion. And if you're wrong, her expression didn't change, then you can buy this land from the bank in the spring. I'm sure they'll give you a fair price. It wasn't a joke, it was a simple statement of fact. Silas felt something cold settling in his chest. This wasn't grief, madness, this was calculation. She knew exactly what she was risking. Mrs. Thorne, I'm not trying to buy your land out from under you. I'm trying to keep you and those children alive. I know, she said, and her voice was suddenly gentle, almost kind. I know you are Mr. Vaughan, and I appreciate it, but I'm going to do this my way. She picked up her spade and returned to digging. Silas sat there for another moment, wanting to say something more, something that would make her see reason. But looking at the set of her shoulders, the methodical rhythm of her work, he knew there were no words that would change her mind. He turned his horse and rode away, and behind him Nathaniel Thorne dumped another bucket of dirt, and his mother sank another hole into the hard October earth. That evening, Silas told his wife Lydia about it. They sat in the warmth of their own sturdy homestone walls, thick roof, a fireplace that could heat 3 rooms at once. 30 years of successful ranching had built this comfort. 30 years of knowing how to survive Wyoming winters. She's planting trees, he said, still incredulous, in circles around the cabin. Says it's going to protect her from the wind better than a fence. Lydia, mending one of his shirts by lamplight, glanced up. What kind of trees? I don't know. Does it matter? They're going to be twigs. Useless. Your mother planted hedgerows, Lydia said quietly. Silas paused. That was different. Was it? He remembered. Ireland, 1848. He'd been 8 years old when his mother had insisted on planting hawthorn hedges around their small farm despite his father's objections. The old country ways, his father had called it, superstition and waste. They'd argued about it for weeks. The hedges had saved their crops that winter when a storm flattened every exposed field for miles around. His father never admitted he'd been wrong, but he never cut down the hedges either. This is different, Silas said again, but with less conviction. Lydia returned to her mending. That woman lost her husband. She has two small children and a debt she can barely pay. If she says she knows what she's doing, maybe the kindness is to let her try. The kindness is to keep her alive, Silas insisted. Sometimes those are the same thing. He had no answer to that. The next day he rode into town and sent a letter to the territorial governor's office. Not to cause trouble, not to interfere, just to request that someone, a county official perhaps, or a circuit judge, check on the Thorne homestead before winter set in. Make sure the children were being properly cared for. Make sure grief hadn't clouded the widow's judgment to the point of danger. He told himself it was the responsible thing to do. He told himself it was concern, not condescension. He almost believed it. October bled into its final week. Willa Thorne worked from dawn until the light failed. She'd hired help, a young man named Ezra Sullivan, 19 years old, son of a drunk who'd frozen to death the previous winter. The boy was strong and willing and grateful for the work. Together they made trips to Cottonwood Creek, 2 miles south, where young trees grew thick along the protected banks. She chose each tree with care, Douglas fir mostly, some ponderosa pine, a few cottonwoods for the outer ring. She examined root systems, branch patterns, overall health, rejected more than she selected. Each chosen tree was carefully excavated, roots wrapped in damp burlap, loaded onto a small handcart that Robert had built years ago. The journey back was slow, the cart was heavy, Willa pulled, Ezra pushed, and sometimes young Nathaniel helped with his small hands on the rough wood. One afternoon, as they worked near the creek, an old Arapaho man approached. He moved quietly. Willa didn't notice him until he was less than 20 feet away watching them work. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited. The man was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, hard to tell. His face was weathered leather, his hair iron gray, and worn in 2 long braids. He wore a mix of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin shirt, wool pants, beaded moccasins. "You take many trees," he said. His English was accented but clear. "I'm planting them around my home," Willa explained, "for protection." The old man nodded slowly. He walked to one of the wrapped saplings and examined it with the same careful attention Willa herself had used when selecting it. "You plant in circles?" "Yes." "How many circles?" "3. Inner ring of Douglas fir very close together, middle ring of pine wider spacing, outer ring of cottonwood wider still." The man's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "You know the old way." "I know a way," Willa said carefully, "and I learned it from my father. My people plant willows in circles around our winter camps, not to stop wind, to make wind work for us. Wind brings snow, snow builds walls, walls keep warm." He gestured at the wrapped trees. "You do the same. But white men, they do not do this. White men build walls of wood and fight the wind." "My husband built walls of wood," Willa said quietly. "The wind destroyed them." The old man nodded. "Wind does not like to be stopped. Wind likes to be guided." He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. Unfolding it, he revealed a small bundle of dried plants, tobacco, sage, sweetgrass. "My name is Tall Elk. I have seen 63 winters. I know when white woman does wise thing." He held out the bundle. "Burn this when you doubt. Smoke rises. Reminds you wind can lift, not just push." Willa took the bundle, feeling the dry rustle of the plants against her palm. "Thank you." "You have far to go," Tall Elk said, looking at the cart with its few wrapped trees, then back toward where the cabin sat invisible beyond the rolling prairie. "Winter comes soon. I know. You will finish." "I have to." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once decisively. "You will finish." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the cottonwoods as quietly as he'd appeared. Ezra, who'd been standing silent and wide-eyed through the entire exchange, let out a breath. "That was Tall Elk. He's some kind of medicine man or holy person or something. People say he can predict the weather just by tasting the air. Can he? Willa asked. I don't know, but he's never wrong. Willa tucked the sacred bundle into her apron pocket and bent to lift the cart handles. Then we'd better keep working. By the final week of October, 40 trees stood in their places. The inner ring was taking shape, Douglas fir saplings, each about 4 feet tall, planted in a circle just 10 feet from the cabin walls. Spacing between them 4 feet, close enough that their branches would interweave as they grow, dense enough to create a living barrier. The work was brutal. The ground had grown harder as the weather cooled. Each hole required an hour of labor, pickaxe to break the soil, spade to excavate, hands to clear rocks. Willa's palms were a geography of blisters and calluses. Her back ached constantly. She'd lost more weight. Her dresses hung loose, but the trees stood. She mixed the soil for each one carefully. The prairie dirt was thin, more clay than loam. She'd haul richer soil from the creek bank, blend it with what she'd excavated, add water to make a thick slurry. Each tree was planted with ceremony, positioned, backfilled, tamped, firm, watered thoroughly. Nathaniel helped when he could. He learned the names of the trees, learned to identify them by bark and needle. Beatrice was too young for the heavy work, but she brought water and sang songs and somehow made the labor feel less lonely. On the 5th of November, the first hard frost came. Willa woke to find the world transformed. Every blade of grass was encased in crystal. The water bucket by the door had a skin of ice. The sky was pale and hard, and 28 of her trees were dead. She walked the circles that morning, touching each one, confirming what she already knew. The needles were brown, brittle. The bark had split in places, frozen solid and killed. 28 trees out of 40 planted, more than half. She stood in the center of her unfinished fortress and felt doubt crush down on her like physical weight. Maybe Silas Vaughan was right. Maybe this was foolishness. Maybe she was gambling her children's lives on a theory she'd learned as a child, sitting at her father's knee, listening to stories about forests in far-off Vermont. This wasn't Vermont. This was Wyoming. The rules might be different here. The wind might be different here. She might have killed her children with her pride. Mama. Nathaniel stood behind her, bundled in his coat, his breath pluming white in the cold air. Some of the trees died, she said. I know. I counted them. Of course he had. Her brilliant, careful boy. Mama, in Papa's journal, the one he kept by the bed, he wrote about the windbreak, about how you told him it wouldn't work, about how he should have listened to you. Willa closed her eyes. Your father was a good man. He was, but he was wrong about the fence. And you were right. Nathaniel moved closer, slipped his small hand into hers. The trees that died, they're the ones on the south side, where the sun hit them all day and then the frost came at night. The trees on the north side are fine. You just planted the wrong ones in the wrong places. She looked down at him, 7 years old and already seeing patterns, making observations. You're right, she said slowly. The Engelmann spruce, they're alpine trees. They don't handle the temperature swings. I should have used Douglas fir throughout. So we plant more Douglas fir? Nathaniel said simply, and we finish before the big snow comes. We, such a small word, such enormous weight. Willa squeezed her son's hand and made a decision. We plant more Douglas fir, she agreed, and we finish before the big snow comes. That night there was a knock on the cabin door. Willa opened it to find Constance Mercer standing on the step holding a covered basket. Constance was 45, a widow herself, a woman who'd survived 8 Wyoming winters alone. She had a face like weathered wood and eyes that missed nothing. May I come in? Willa stepped aside. Constance set the basket on the table, bread, butter, a small pot of honey. Then she reached into her coat and withdrew a leather purse, set it beside the basket. There's $175 in there, she said. It's everything I've saved over the past 6 years. I want you to use it to finish what you're doing. Willa stared at the purse. Mrs. Mercer, I can't. My husband's name was Thomas. He died in the winter of 79. We had a bad storm coming. I could feel it in my bones the way my grandmother taught me, and I begged him to bring the cattle in close to reinforce the barn to prepare. He told me I was being hysterical, that he'd weathered plenty of storms and didn't need a woman telling him how to ranch. Constance's voice was flat factual, reporting history. The storm lasted 4 days. Thomas went out on the third day to check the herd. I told him not to, he went anyway. They found him 3 weeks later when the snow melted, frozen solid face down in a drift quarter-mile from the house. She looked at Willa. Men like my Thomas, like your Robert, like Silas Vaughan, they're good men, honest men, but they think strength means fighting. They think wisdom means experience. They don't understand that sometimes the smartest thing is to listen, to learn, to try something new. She pushed the purse across the table. I watched you work. I've seen your design. I know what you're trying to do. And I'll be damned if I'm going to watch another widow lose everything because the men around her are too proud to admit a woman might know something they don't. Willa's throat was tight. Thank you. Don't thank me. Finish those trees, prove them wrong. That'll be thanks enough. After Constance left, Willa sat at the table and counted the money. $175. Enough to buy more burlap, to hire Ezra for another month to purchase supplies for the winter. Enough to finish. The next morning, she and Ezra returned to Cottonwood Creek. November accelerated toward its end like a falling stone. Willa replanted the dead trees with Douglas fir. Adjusted the spacing in the middle ring ponderosa pine, now 12 feet apart instead of 15. Added native buffalo grass between the trees in the outer ring, following a suggestion from Ezra. The grass would stabilize the soil trap early snow, create an additional layer of wind resistance. The work consumed her, dawn to dark every day. Her hands were raw meat. Her shoulders burned. She moved through exhaustion into a kind of trance state where there was only the next hole, the next tree, the next careful tamping of soil. Ezra worked beside her without complaint. The boy was stronger than he looked, and he understood somehow what this meant, what was at stake. On November 20th, they planted the final tree, number 118. A ponderosa pine in the middle ring northwestern quadrant. Willa stood back and looked at what she'd built. 3 concentric circles of saplings around her small cabin. The inner ring Douglas fir 4 feet apart, 70 trees total. The middle ring ponderosa pine 12 feet apart, 32 trees. The outer ring cottonwoods 15 feet apart, 16 trees. From above it would look like a target, the cabin at the bullseye. From the ground it looked fragile, pitiful, a child's attempt to fence in the wind with twigs. But Willa didn't see twigs, she saw vectors, angles, pressure gradients. She saw wind flowing through the outer ring, slowing, hitting the middle ring, slowing more, reaching the inner ring already exhausted, dropping its burden of snow among the trees instead of against the cabin walls. She saw physics, mathematics, the patient architecture of moving air. It's done, Ezra said, leaning on his spade. It's done, Willa agreed. That night she paid him the last of what she owed, including a bonus from Constance's money, and thanked him for his work. You think it'll work? He asked. I know it will. Folks in town think you're crazy. I know that too, he grinned. Well, if you survive the winter, I'm going to tell them all they're fools. If I survive the winter, Willa said, I'll tell them myself. 3 days later, Silas Vaughan came calling. He rode up in the afternoon, dismounted, tied his horse to the porch rail. Willa met him at the door, wiping flour from her hands. She'd been baking bread. The cabin smelled of yeast and warmth. Mr. Vaughan? Mrs. Thorne. He removed his hat. I wanted to speak with you before the snows come. Of course, come in. He stepped inside, ducked his head to clear the low door frame. The cabin was small but tidy. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Nathaniel sat at the table practicing his letters on a slate. Beatrice played with wooden blocks in the corner. Fine children, Silas observed. Thank you. He turned his hat in his hands. This was difficult for him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Mrs. Thorne, I'm going to be direct with you. Winter is perhaps 2 weeks away. I've seen the work you've done, the trees you've planted, and I'll grant you it's an impressive effort. Shows dedication, shows intelligence. But those trees are too small. They can't possibly provide the protection you need. A major storm will bury this place. And with the debt you owe the bank and 2 children to feed and no husband to help you through the hard months. I know my circumstances, Mr. Vaughan. Then you know how precarious they are. He took a breath. I am prepared to offer you $900 for this property. That's more than fair market value. It's enough to pay off the bank, enough to set you up in town with a small house enough to live on for a year while you find work. I'll even hire you as my bookkeeper, $60 a year steady income. And you get 160 acres of land for less than $6 an acre. I get land I'll have to improve and build on, yes. But more importantly, you and your children get safety, security, a future that doesn't depend on whether a circle of saplings can stop a blizzard. Willa wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the window and looked out at her trees. They stood in their patient ranks, thin and fragile, looking in the gray November light. When I was 10 years old, she said quietly, my father took me into the White Mountains during a storm. There was a thick stand of balsam fir on a hillside, young trees not much bigger than what I've planted here. We stepped into that stand and the world changed. The wind that had been screaming outside just stopped. It was warm, quiet, peaceful. The snow was falling among the trees, packing around them, building walls. She turned to face Silas. My father showed me that a solid barrier creates turbulence, but a porous screen creates calm. He showed me the mathematics of it, the fluid dynamics, and he told me that nature doesn't fight nature, nature uses nature. Mrs. Thorne, I appreciate your concern, Mr. Vaughan, truly, and I appreciate your offer, but I'm not selling what my husband died trying to protect. I'm not teaching my children that the smart thing to do when faced with a challenge is to give up and run away. Silas's jaw tightened. I'm not suggesting you run away. I'm suggesting you make a practical choice. And I'm suggesting that what looks practical to you looks like surrender to me. They stood there in the small cabin, 2 people separated by certainty and neither one willing to bend. Finally, Silas put his hat back on. I hope you're right, Mrs. Thorne. For your sake and for those children's sake, I truly hope you're right. So do I, Mr. Vaughan. He left, and Willa watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode away. A dark figure against the pale grass heading toward his own ranch where stone walls and 3 decades of experience waited to protect him from the coming winter. That night she wrote in her journal by lamplight. November 23rd, 1886. All trees planted, 118 total. Survival rate after frost, 78%. Acceptable given early frost timing. Weather signs indicate major storm system approaching within 10 to 14 days. Barometric pressure dropping steadily. Ravens migrating south 3 weeks early. Cattle restless. All historical indicators point to severe winter. She paused, pen hovering over paper. Robert, if you can hear me wherever you are, I hope I'm doing the right thing. I hope I'm not too proud. I hope I'm not too stubborn. I hope I'm just smart enough. She closed the journal and banked the fire and checked on her sleeping children one last time before lying down in the bed she had once shared with her husband. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it testing the cabin, probing for weakness. And around the cabin, 118 small trees stood in their careful circles and began their first real work, stealing tiny bits of energy from the moving air, one needle, one branch, one tree at a time. The last week of November brought a false warmth. The temperature climbed into the mid-40s. The sky was pale blue. The wind died to almost nothing. Willa knew what it meant, the calm before the catastrophe, the inhale before the scream. She made her final preparations with methodical care, brought in wood until the cabin walls were lined with stacked cordwood, enough for 10 days of constant fire, drew extra water from the well, filled every container she owned, Checked the chimney, cleaned the flue, ensured proper draft, brought the 4 best laying hens into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, gave them extra feed and fresh straw, inventoried her food supplies: 50 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, quince pounds of salt pork, 2 wheels of cheese, 3 dozen eggs, dried apples, canned vegetables from the summer garden, wild honey, coffee, tea, sugar, salt. Enough for 3 weeks if they were careful. On December 1st, the bank manager came calling. Mr. Edmund Garrett was a thin man with precise manners and eyes like arithmetic. He arrived in a buggy carrying a leather portfolio, wearing a suit that looked expensive and impractical. Mrs. Thorne, I apologize for the intrusion, but I wanted to review the terms of your loan before winter made travel difficult. Willa invited him in, offered him coffee, which he declined. The principal amount is $600, he said, consulting papers from his portfolio. With 6% annual interest, the total due by March 15, 1887 will be $636. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure and public auction of the property. I understand the terms, Mr. Garrett. Do you have a plan for repayment? I'll sell cattle in the spring. 18 head should bring approximately $730 at current market rates. Garrett made a note. And if you don't survive the winter? The question hung in the air like smoke. If I don't survive the winter, Mr. Garrett, then the question of repayment becomes moot, doesn't it? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Thorne, I'm simply doing my job. I know, and I'm simply planning to survive. After he left, Constance Mercer appeared at the door. She'd been waiting down the road, watching. That man is a vulture, she declared. He's a banker. It's his job to worry about loans. Did you tell him about the trees? Oh, no? Why not? Willa smiled faintly. Because he wouldn't understand, just like Silas Vaughan doesn't understand, just like most of this territory doesn't understand. They see twigs. I see infrastructure. And if you're wrong, then come spring, you can say you knew me when and tell stories about the crazy widow who tried to fancy in the wind. Constance snorted. If you're right, I'm going to plant my own damn trees and tell every man in Wyoming they're fools. On December 10th, the sky changed. It turned a peculiar shade of gray-white like old pewter. The light was flat, directionless. The temperature held steady at 40 degrees, but the air felt wrong, thick, waiting. The cattle bunched together nervously. The chickens refused to leave their coop. Birds disappeared from the sky. Tall elk appeared at midday, walking across the prairie as if he had materialized from the grass itself. 3 days, he said without preamble, maybe 4. Worst storm in 20 winters. Wind from north very strong, snow very deep. How long will it last, though? 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at her circles of trees, walked among them, touched branches. Good spacing, good species choice, but very young, very small. Will they work? Tall Elk was silent for a long moment. I do not know, he said finally, and the honesty of it was almost worse than a negative answer. Trees are right, design is right, but trees are children and storm is war. Chief, children sometimes surprise, sometimes not. He reached into his pouch and withdrew another bundle larger than the first. Sweetgrass sage and something else Willa didn't recognize. Burn this when storm comes, not for magic, for courage. Smoke will remind you to breathe. Breathing is how you survive fear. Thank you, Tall Elk. He touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of respect, of solidarity, and walked away into the strange gray light. That afternoon, Silas Vaughan came riding up one last time. He dismounted, approached the cabin, and stood there turning his hat in his hands. Behind him, the sky was the color of a bruise. Mrs. Thorne, I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to say this anyway because my conscience won't allow me to do otherwise. Willa waited. A storm is coming, a bad one. I can feel it, the animals can feel it, even the air feels wrong. This is going to be the kind of storm that kills people, the kind that collapses barns and freezes cattle where they stand. I know. Then please, for the love of God and the sake of those children, come to my ranch, bring the kids, stay with us until it passes. My wife will welcome you. You'll be safe. You'll be warm. And when it's over, we can talk about the land, about the debt, about everything else. But right now, tonight, don't stay here. Willa looked at him. This man who had offered to help in the only way he knew how. This man who genuinely believed she was wrong and was terrified she'd pay for that wrongness with her life and the lives of her children. Mr. Vaughan, she said gently, I appreciate your offer, I appreciate your concern, but we're staying. Mrs. Thorne, we're staying. This is our home. These, she gestured at the rings of small trees, are our protection, and I believe in what I've built here. Silas looked at the trees, then at her. His face was a mixture of frustration, admiration, and genuine fear. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, he said quietly, or the most foolish. I honestly don't know which. Neither do I, Mr. Vaughan. I suppose we'll find out in a few days. He put his hat on, mounted his horse, looked down at her one last time. Then may God watch over you, Mrs. Thorne, and over you, Mr. Vaughan. He rode away, and Willa watched until he disappeared over the rise, heading west toward his stone ranch house and his solid barn, and his 30 years of accumulated wisdom about how to survive Wyoming winters. Then she turned and looked at her cabin, her small, exposed, vulnerable cabin surrounded by 118 saplings that came up to her chest. Everything she'd learned, everything her father had taught her, everything she believed about wind and physics and the patient architecture of moving air, it all came down to this. 3 days, maybe 4. She went inside and found Nathaniel and Beatrice playing by the fire. Children, she said, come help me bring in the last of the wood. On the morning of December 11th, the sky held its breath. The temperature had dropped overnight from 40 degrees to 28, but there was no wind. None at all. The air was perfectly unnaturally still. Willa stood outside the cabin at dawn and felt the wrongness of it press against her skin. The silence was profound. No bird song, no rustle of grass, no creak of wood or whisper of breeze, just emptiness waiting to be filled. She spent the day in final preparation, stuffed rags into every gap around the door and windows, moved the children's bed closer to the fireplace, made a thick stew of salt pork and beans and potatoes, enough to last 3 days if they were careful, filled the lamps with oil, checked the chimney one last time. Nathaniel helped without being asked. At 7 years old, he understood that something significant was about to happen. Beatrice was less certain, but she stayed close to her mother and brother, sensing their tension. As afternoon faded toward evening, Willa stepped outside one last time. The sky was darkening in the north, not the darkness of night, but something else, something solid and approaching. She walked the circles of her trees, touching each one. The Douglas fir in the inner ring, the ponderosa pine in the middle, the cottonwoods on the outside. They were so small, so fragile looking. But she could see what others couldn't. She could see the spaces between the trees, the gaps would break wind into smaller currents. She could see the way they were arranged, staggered, overlapping fields of fire like soldiers in a defensive formation. She could see the mathematics of it, the fluid dynamics, the elegant simplicity of using force against itself. A solid wall would fail, a porous screen would succeed. She had to believe that. She had to. As darkness fell, the wind began. It started as a whisper, a gentle touch against the western side of the cabin. Then it built, slowly at first, then faster. Within an hour it was a presence. Within 2 hours it was a force. By nightfall it was a living thing. Willa lit the lamps and the fire, made sure the children had eaten, read them a story from the only book they owned, a Bible that had belonged to her mother. Then she tucked them into bed and sat in the rocking chair Robert had made years ago before everything went wrong. Outside the wind roared. It was a sound like nothing else on earth, not quite human, not quite animal. The voice of pure elemental rage testing the world for weakness. She listened to it with every sense she possessed. There should have been a high whistle, The sound of wind hitting the sharp edge of the roof line and screaming across it, but there wasn't. The sound was deeper, more diffuse. The wind was flowing over the cabin, yes, but smoothly, without the turbulence that created that distinctive shriek. The trees were working already, even at this small size. They were lifting the wind, guiding it up and over, exactly as she'd hoped. But this was just the beginning. The storm hadn't truly arrived yet. This was the outrider, the scout, the promise of what was coming. Willa pulled tall elk's bundle from her apron pocket, opened it. The dried plants inside smelled of summer and smoke and something wild she couldn't name. She threw a pinch into the fire. Sweet smoke curled up and she breathed it in and let it remind her of what the old man had said. Smoke rises, wind can lift, not just push. Outside in the darkness, snow began to fall. The snow came softly at first. Will awoke before dawn on December 12 to a world transformed into shadow and silence. The wind had not stopped. She could still hear it, a deep, constant roar like distant waterfalls, but something about the quality of sound had changed, muffled, softened. She rose from the rocking chair where she dozed fitfully through the night and moved to the window, scraped away the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass, despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth. What she saw made her breath catch. Snow. Everywhere. Not falling now, but accumulated. The world had become a study in white and gray, all familiar landmarks erased or reduced to abstract shapes beneath a blanket that seemed to have no end. But the area immediately around the cabin, perhaps 15 feet in every direction, held only a light dusting, maybe 3 inches, soft and undisturbed like flowers sifted onto a dark surface. Beyond that circle of calm, the snow deepened dramatically. She could see the outer ring of cottonwoods, or rather, she could see the upper branches. The lower portions were buried, and between the trees, snow had accumulated into drifts that rose and fell in sculptured waves, following patterns created by wind currents. She couldn't see but could imagine with perfect clarity. The middle ring was less visible, just the tips of the ponderosa pines showing through dark green against white. The inner ring of Douglas fir was completely buried. She knew the trees were there, could picture their exact positions from memory, but they disappeared beneath the snow as completely as if they'd never existed. And yet, the cabin stood in its circle of relative calm, and the wind that she could hear raging just beyond her walls was not reaching her door with the violence it should have possessed. The trees were working, even buried, even invisible. They were doing exactly what she designed them to do, breaking the wind into smaller pieces, stealing its energy, forcing it to drop its burden of snow before it reached the cabin. Behind her, Nathaniel stirred in his bed. "Mama, I'm here, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." "Is it bad outside?" "Yes, but we're safe in here." She heard him settle back down, and a moment later his breathing deepened into sleep once more. Willa added wood to the fire and put coffee on to boil and tried not to think about how much more snow might fall before this was over. By mid-morning, the storm had found its full voice. The wind that had been merely strong became ferocious. It hit the cabin in waves, periodic surges that made the whole structure shudder. Willa could feel it through the floorboards, through the walls, through the air itself. The children were awake now, frightened but trying to be brave. "It sounds angry," Beatrice said, huddled close to her brother. "It's just wind," Nathaniel told her, though his own voice was tight with fear. "It can't hurt us." But he looked to his mother for confirmation. Willa knelt beside them, pulled them both close. "Listen carefully," she said. "Tell me what you hear." They fell silent, focusing. "Roaring," Nathaniel said. "Like a monster," Beatrice added. "Yes, but listen to where the sound is coming from. Is it right on top of us? Is it hitting the walls directly?" Nathaniel's face crunched in concentration. "No, it's above us, like it's going over the roof." "Exactly." Willa kept her voice calm, educational. "The wind is being lifted by the trees. It's flowing over us, not at us. Do you remember the diagram I drew about how the trees break up the wind?" "I remember," Nathaniel said. That's what's happening right now. The outer trees slow the wind down, the middle trees slow it more. The inner trees, even though they're buried, are creating resistance at ground level. By the time the wind reaches us, it's exhausted most of its strength. But it sounds so loud, Beatrice whispered. Loud doesn't always mean dangerous. The loudness is above us. We're in the quiet part underneath. It was a simplification but true enough, and it seemed to comfort them. She made breakfast cornmeal mush with honey and dried apples. They ate by the fire, and she told them stories about Vermont, about their grandfather Jonas, who could read weather in the patterns of leaves and predict snowfall by the way deer moved through the forest. Was grandfather smarter than Papa? Nathaniel asked. It was a dangerous question, one that could hurt. Your father was very smart, Willa said carefully. But he and your grandfather knew different things. Your grandfather knew trees and weather. Your father knew animals and land. Different kinds of smart. But Papa's windbreak didn't work, Nathaniel said. Not cruel, just factual. A child trying to make sense of the world. No, it didn't, because your father tried to stop the wind instead of working with it. That doesn't make him not smart, it makes him human. We all make mistakes, Nate. The important thing is learning from them. Is that what you're doing? Learning from Papa's mistake? Yes. And if your trees don't work, you'll die like Papa died. The bluntness of it hit her like cold water. Beatrice started crying. Willa pulled them both close, wrapped them in her arms, and felt the weight of what she'd gambled pressing down like the snow outside. The trees will work, she said, I promise you. It was a promise she had no right to make. But she made it anyway, because what else could she do? The day crawled forward. Willa kept the fire fed and the children occupied. They played quiet games, drew pictures on the slate. Nathaniel practiced his letters. Beatrice sang songs their father had taught her, and if her voice broke sometimes with memory, no one mentioned it. The storm outside continued without pause. Every hour, Willa would scrape frost from the window and look out. Every hour, the snow was deeper. The world was being erased, buried beneath white. But the circle around the cabin remained relatively clear. She could see how it was working now. The snow was falling among the buried trees, packing between them, adding to the barrier. Each new layer of snow made the windbreak more effective, not less. The storm was building her walls for her exactly as tall Elk had said his people's willows did. Nature using nature. By afternoon, visibility had dropped to nearly zero. The world beyond the window was a churning white void. Willa couldn't see the outer trees anymore. Couldn't see anything except chaos and motion. The temperature inside the cabin held steady at 38 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath, but warm enough to survive with blankets and the fire. She checked their supplies. Plenty of wood she'd stacked, enough for 10 days, and had only used 1 day's worth. Water was holding. Food was fine. They could outlast this. They would outlast this. As darkness fell on the first full day of the storm, Willa lit the lamps and made dinner and pretended everything was normal. The children ate without complaint, though she could see the fear in their eyes every time a particularly strong gust hit the cabin and made the walls groan. After dinner, Nathaniel asked the question she'd been dreading. Mama, do you think Mr. Vaughn is all right? She thought about Silas in his stone ranch house 3 miles away. Thought about his solid barn and his years of experience and his certainty that he knew how to survive Wyoming winters. I'm sure he's fine, she said. His ranch is very well built, but his windbreak broke last time. He probably built a new one, a stronger one. Nathaniel nodded, accepting this, but his face was troubled. Mama, why didn't Mr. Vaughn believe you about the trees? It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Because what I'm doing is different from what people expect. People trust what they know, what they've seen work before. Mr. Vaughn has built fence windbreaks his whole life. They're what he understands. My trees are new, strange, and it's hard for people to trust something strange, especially when it comes from someone they think of as less experienced. Because you're a woman. Willa smiled faintly. Partly that, but also because I'm young and because I'm alone. And because my husband tried something and failed, so they assume I'll fail too. But you won't. No, sweetheart, I won't. She said it with confidence she didn't entirely feel. That night, the storm grew worse. Willa dozed in the rocking chair again, startling awake every time the wind hit a particularly savage pitch. The sound was incredible, a freight train roar mixed with a banshee shriek mixed with something that sounded almost like voices screaming in rage. She got up twice to add wood to the fire, checked the door barricade, made sure no drafts were getting through. Around midnight, she heard a new sound, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, then another. She froze, listening. Crack, 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 crack. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the trees. Her heart sank. They were breaking. The young trees, loaded with snow bent by wind, were snapping under the pressure. She moved to the window, tried to see, but visibility was zero, just white chaos and darkness. Another crack, fainter this time, maybe from the middle ring. How many had she lost? 10 trees, 20, half of them. If too many broke, the system would fail. The gaps would allow wind through, the protection would collapse. She stood at the window, hands pressed against the cold glass, and felt helplessness wash over her. There was nothing she could do, no way to go out there and reinforce them, no way to help. She could only stand here and listen to her careful design break apart one tree at a time and hope that enough survived to maintain the barrier. More cracks, a whole series of them like gunfire. Beatrice woke, crying. What's that noise? Just the storm, baby, just the wind. Go back to sleep. But Nathaniel was awake too, and he came to stand beside her at the window. The trees are breaking, he said quietly. Some of them, yes. Will we be okay? Willa pulled him close. Yes, we'll be okay. She didn't know if it was true, but she said it anyway. The cracking sounds continued for another hour, then gradually faded. Either the trees had finished breaking, or the wind had shifted, or she simply couldn't hear them anymore over the general roar of the storm. She went back to the rocking chair and sat in the darkness, listening to her children breathe, and the storm rage and the small sounds of wood burning in the fireplace. Somewhere out there, Silas Vaughan was probably warm in his stone house, vindicated in his certainty that she'd been wrong. Somewhere out there, her trees, the ones that were left, continued their patient work. And somewhere deep in her chest, doubt began to whisper that maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she was a fool. Maybe pride and stubbornness were not the same as wisdom. Maybe she'd killed her children after all. Dawn on December 13 brought no relief. If anything, the storm was worse. The wind had shifted direction now, coming from the northwest instead of straight north, and the sound it made was different. Higher pitched, more varied, like it was searching for weakness, probing every surface for a way in. Willa made breakfast mechanically. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind calculated and recalculated, trying to determine how many trees she could afford to lose before the system failed completely. She'd started with 118 trees. If she'd lost 20 in the night, which seemed possible based on the cracking sounds, she still had 98. Was that enough? The spacing would be wrong in places. There would be gaps. But maybe the snow accumulation would compensate. Maybe the drifts themselves would serve as windbreak. Maybe. That word was becoming a prayer. Mama, you need to eat, Nathaniel said, pushing a bowl of mush toward her. She looked down at it, couldn't remember sitting at the table. You're right, thank you, sweetheart. She forced herself to eat. The food tasted like ashes, but she made herself finish it. The children needed to see her strong, needed to believe she knew what she was doing. After breakfast, she tried to teach them lessons, arithmetic for Nathaniel, letters for Beatrice, anything to maintain routine, anything to pretend this was normal. But the storm made concentration impossible. It was louder today, more aggressive. The cabin shook with each gust. Dust filtered down from between the roof boards. The temperature inside had dropped to 34 degrees despite the fire burning constantly. They were burning through wood faster than she'd planned. At this rate, they'd run out in 7 days instead of 10. Willa did the math in her head. If the storm lasted 3 days, Tall Elk had said 3, maybe 4, they'd have enough. Barely. But if it went longer, she pushed the thought away. Midday arrived, though the darkness outside made it hard to tell. The only way she knew was by the small clock on the mantel, a wedding gift from her parents, still keeping time in a world that felt like it had stopped. I'm cold, Beatrice said, wrapped in 2 blankets. Come closer to the fire, baby. I'm already close. She was, they all were, huddled around the hearth like refugees, which in a sense they were. Willa added more wood, watched the flames leap higher, calculated how much remained stacked against the wall. Not enough. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome. Not enough wood, not enough protection, not enough wisdom to save her children from the consequences of her pride. Mama, Nathaniel was watching her with those serious gray eyes that saw too much. Yes. Are we going to die? The question hung in the warm air above the fire. Beatrice started crying again. Willa pulled them both onto her lap, too big for it really, but they folded themselves into her arms anyway and held them as tight as she could. No, she said, we're not going to die. How do you know? Because the trees are working. Can't you feel it? The wind is loud, yes, but it's not hitting us directly. We're in the calm space, the protected space, exactly where we're supposed to be. But the trees broke last night. I heard them. Some broke, not all. And the ones that are left are strong enough. Trust me. I do trust you, Mama, but I'm still scared. Being scared is okay. Being scared and being safe can happen at the same time. She wasn't sure she believed that, but she said it with enough conviction that Nathaniel nodded against her shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the 3 of them tangled together, listening to the storm try to tear apart the world. The afternoon stretched into evening with agonizing slowness. Willa made dinner beans and salt pork, the same meal as the night before. They were rationing now without discussing it. Everyone understood. The wind showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was building toward some kind of crescendo. The roar had become almost constant, broken only by occasional moments of relative quiet that felt more ominous than the noise itself. During one of those quiet moments, they heard something new, a grinding, creaking sound, prolonged and tortured, then a crash that shook the ground. What was that? Beatrice whispered. Willa didn't answer immediately. She was listening, trying to identify the sound, trying to locate its source. Another crash, closer this time. Understanding came with cold certainty. Trees were falling, not just breaking, falling completely. The weight of snow plus the force of wind was uprooting them, toppling them. She thought of the cottonwoods in the outer ring. Tall, slender, not deeply rooted yet, they'd be the most vulnerable. How many were down? How many gaps had just opened in her carefully designed defense? There was no way to know. She fed the fire and told the children stories and tried not to let them see the fear that was eating her alive from the inside. That night was the longest of her life. The storm reached a pitch of fury that seemed impossible to sustain. The wind sounded like it was trying to physically tear the cabin from its foundation. Snow drove against the walls with such force it sounded like sand being thrown by handfuls. The temperature inside dropped to 31 degrees. Willa piled every blanket they owned onto the children's bed, then sat beside them in the rocking chair wrapped in Robert's old coat and tried to stay awake in case something went wrong. What would she do if something went wrong? The question mocked her. If the roof blew off, they'd freeze in minutes. If the door burst open, the wind would steal every bit of warmth in seconds. If the fire went out, don't think about it. Keep the fire burning. That's all you can do. She got up every hour to add the wood. The stack against the wall was shrinking at an alarming rate. 4 more days of wood left, maybe 5 if they burned less. But they couldn't burn less, not with the temperature this low. Around midnight, Nathaniel woke screaming. Willa was beside him instantly. What's wrong? Are you hurt? He was shaking, eyes wide and glassy. Papa was here. He said we're going to die like he did. He said you made a mistake. You were dreaming, sweetheart. Just a bad dream. It felt real. I know, but it wasn't. Your father would never say that. He'd want us to survive. He'd want us to be brave. I'm not brave, Mama. I'm scared. Oh, baby. She pulled him close, felt his heart racing against her chest. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. Brave means being scared and going on anyway. You're the bravest boy I know. He clung to her and cried, and she let him because sometimes crying was the only reasonable response to impossible situations. Beatrice woke too frightened by her brother's tears, and soon both children were crying, and Willa was holding them and rocking them and singing lullabies her own mother had sung to her decades ago in a green land that felt like a dream now. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, three people huddled together and tried to believe they'd see morning. Morning came. Grey and horrible, but morning nonetheless. December 14th, day 3 of the storm, Willa stood at the window scraping frost and looked out at devastation. The world had been completely reshaped. Nothing looked the same. Where there had been gentle rolling prairie, there were now drifts 20 feet high, in some places bare ground scoured clean in others. The wind had sculpted the landscape into something alien and hostile. Of her trees she could see almost nothing. The outer ring was gone, completely buried or blown down, she couldn't tell. The middle ring was invisible except for a few dark shapes that might have been the tops of pines or might have been shadows in the blowing snow. The inner ring was utterly buried. But the area around the cabin still held only moderate snow, maybe 6 inches now instead of 3, still manageable, still protected. And the wind, though loud, still wasn't hitting them directly. Something was still working. Either the buried trees were providing enough resistance, or the snowdrifts themselves had taken over the role of windbreak, or some combination of both. The system was holding. Damaged maybe, depleted certainly, but holding. Is it over? Nathaniel asked from the bed. But not yet, sweetheart. When will it be over? Soon. She hoped that was true. They ate a cold breakfast. There wasn't enough wood to keep the fire burning high enough for cooking, and they needed to conserve. Dried apples and hard cheese and water that had to be thawed from ice in the bucket. The children didn't complain. They'd moved beyond complaint into a kind of numb acceptance. They sat wrapped in blankets, silent, conserving energy the way small animals do when resources are scarce. Willa tried to calculate how much longer they could last. Wood 3 days at current burn rate, maybe 4 if they let the fire burn lower, food weeks if it came to that. Water the well was accessible if the storm ended soon. If not, don't think about if not. The clock on the mantel ticked forward, 10 in the morning, 11 noon. The storm continued. Willa dozed in the chair, jerked awake, dozed again. Her body ached from cold and tension. Her eyes felt gritty. Her mind was starting to play tricks. She kept seeing her father standing by the window, or Robert sitting at the table, or Silas Vaughan in the doorway saying, "I told you so." None of it was real. All of it felt real. Around 2 in the afternoon, something changed. It took her several minutes to identify what. The sound. The pitch of the wind had shifted, dropped slightly, not quieter exactly, but different. She stood, moved to the window, looked out. The white chaos was still there, but it seemed less violent, less aggressive, like the storm was finally exhausting itself. Mama Nathaniel was watching her. "What is it?" "I think it's weakening." "The storm?" "Yes." Hope bloomed in his face, and she immediately regretted saying anything. Hope could be worse than fear if it turned out to be false. But over the next hour, the change became undeniable. The wind was dropping, not quickly but steadily. The roar that had been constant for 3 days was gradually diminishing to something more like a strong breeze. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, smaller flakes instead of the driving pellets that had come before. By 4 o'clock, she could see more than 10 feet from the window. By 5, she could make out shapes. The silhouette of the barn, a few dark lumps that might have been the outer trees toppled and half buried. By 6, as darkness fell, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. The silence was shocking. For 3 days there had been constant noise, roaring, shrieking, battering. Now suddenly there was nothing, just the soft hiss of snow falling gently, just the crackle of the fire, just the sound of 3 people breathing. Is it over? Beatrice whispered as if speaking too loud might bring it back. Willa listened, waited, tried to sense if this was real or just a temporary lull. Outside, the snow fell in the peaceful way snow is supposed to fall, straight down, no wind to drive it sideways. Yes, she said, I think it's over. Nathaniel started crying, not from fear this time, but from relief. Beatrice joined him. And Willa, standing by the window with her hand pressed against the cold glass, felt something break open inside her chest. All the fear and doubt and desperate hope of the past 3 days came flooding out, and she was crying too silently, tears running down her face while her children wept and laughed and held each other. They'd survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, against Silas Vaughan's certainty and the bank manager's calculations and the simple brutal mathematics of a Wyoming blizzard, they'd survived. That night they slept. Really slept for the first time in 3 days. Willa banked the fire and wrapped the children in every blanket they owned and lay down beside them in the bed instead of keeping vigil in the rocking chair. She was asleep in seconds. She dreamed of her father, of walking with him through the Vermont woods in winter, stepping into that grove of balsam fir, feeling the wind disappear and the quiet settle around them like a blessing. You did well, he said in the dream. I'm proud of you. I was so scared, Papa. Fear and wisdom can live in the same heart. You proved that. When she woke, it was morning, December 15th. The world outside the window was still, silent, transformed, and she was alive. Her children were alive. They'd made it through. Willa rose from the bed, careful not to wake Nathaniel and Beatrice, and went to the door, put her hand on the wooden bar that sealed it. Hesitated. What would she find out there? How much damage, how many trees destroyed? Would the protection hold for the rest of winter, or had this storm been just the first of many? Only one way to know. She lifted the bar from its bracket, set it aside, gripped the door handle, took a breath, and pushed. The door swung open easily, too easily. She'd expected resistance, expected to have to shove against the drift. But the door opened smoothly, and she stepped across the threshold into a world made new. The morning sun was just rising, painting the snow with shades of pink and gold. The air was cold, brutally cold, maybe 15 below zero, but utterly still, not a breath of wind. And all around the cabin, for perhaps 12 feet in every direction, the ground held only a light covering of snow, maybe 8 inches, soft, undisturbed, like a protective blanket. But beyond that circle of calm, the world had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Snow walls, massive sculpted ramparts of white rising 15, 16, maybe 17 feet high in places. Graceful curves and angles shaped by 3 days of wind into organic architecture that looked almost deliberate. And emerging from those walls like flags on castle battlements were the green tops of her trees. Not all of them. She could see gaps where trees had fallen, could see places where the outer ring had failed completely, but enough. Enough trees had survived. Enough of the system remained intact. The inner ring of Douglas fir was completely buried, but she could tell from the pattern of snow accumulation that they were still there, still standing, still creating a resistance at ground level. The middle ring of ponderosa pine had lost perhaps a third of its members, but the rest stood firm, their upper branches holding the weight of snow that had packed around them. The outer ring of cottonwoods was devastated, maybe half had fallen, but the ones that remained were now part of a larger structure incorporated into the walls of snow the wind itself had built. She'd been right, her father had been right. Nature doesn't fight nature. Nature uses nature. The wind had built her fortress for her, had taken its own weapon, the snow, and transformed it into her shield. Willa walked forward, her boots sinking into the soft powder, reached the edge of the calm zone where the snow deepened dramatically, put her hand on the packed drift. It was solid, dense, perfect insulation. Behind her, she heard the cabin door creak. Mama. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the transformed landscape. "You did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You really did it." "We did it," she corrected. "All of us together." He ran to her, as much as anyone can run through 8 inches of snow, and she caught him and held him and looked out at the fortress of white and green that surrounded their small home. In the distance she saw movement, a figure on horseback struggling through the deep drifts, coming from the west, from the direction of Silas Vaughan's ranch. Willa's breath caught. He was coming to see if they'd survived, coming to confirm that she'd been wrong. Or maybe, and this was a thought that made something warm bloom in her chest, coming to see if she'd been right. The rider drew closer and she could make out details. A man, yes, bundled against the cold, horse laboring through chest-deep snow, definitely Silas. She stood there and waited, her son beside her, as the man who had offered her money and safety and certainty made his slow way toward the widow who'd rejected all three in favor of saplings and science and faith. He stopped perhaps 30 yards out where the snow was too deep for the horse to continue. Dismounted, stood there staring at the scene before him, the cabin untouched and whole, the smoke rising peacefully from the chimney, the child waving at him, the woman standing in a circle of calm while around her rose walls of snow that couldn't exist except that they did. Silas Vaughan took off his hat, stood in the bitter cold and the blinding white, and stared at the impossible made real. Silas Vaughan had seen many things in his 58 years on the Wyoming plains. He'd seen cattle frozen, standing upright in drifts. He'd seen entire homesteads buried so completely that only the chimney pipe marked where a family had lived. He'd seen strong men broken by winter and weak men made strong by necessity, but he had never seen anything like this. He stood in snow, up to his thighs, his horse breathing hard beside him, and tried to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. The cabin stood in a perfect circle of calm. Around it, rising like the walls of some ancient fortress, were ramparts of snow sculpted by wind into curves and angles that looked almost deliberate. And from those walls emerged the green tops of trees, young trees he'd dismissed as useless twigs just weeks ago, standing like sentinels over the impossible sanctuary they'd created. Willa Thorne stood in the center of it all, her son beside her, both of them alive and whole, and watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. He became aware that his mouth was hanging open, closed it, tried to find words and failed. Finally, he simply said, "How?" His voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the profound silence of the morning. Willa smiled, not triumphant, not mocking, just gentle and perhaps a little tired. "Would you like to come inside for coffee, Mr. Vaughan? It's a long story and you look half frozen." He waded toward them, leading his horse. Each step was an effort. The snow was deep and heavy and he was exhausted from the ride. His ranch was only 3 miles away, but it had taken him nearly 2 hours to get here, fighting through drifts that in places were taller than he was. As he reached the edge of the calm zone, the snow abruptly shallowed. One step he was thigh deep, the next he was walking through less than a foot of powder. The transition was so sharp it was almost unnatural. He stopped, looked down at the snow beneath his feet, then at the walls surrounding him. "My God," he whispered. Up close he could see how it had worked. The outer trees, the ones still standing, had caught the first wave of wind and snow, forcing the wind to rise. The drifts around them showed the pattern clearly, snow piled high on the windward side, scooped away on the lee side like sand around rocks in a stream. The middle ring of pines had done the same thing at a higher level, creating a second barrier. And the inner ring, completely buried now, but clearly still there, based on the mounded snow, had created a resistance at ground level, forcing what little wind made it through to drop its last burden before reaching the cabin. 3 filters, 3 stages of wind diffusion. It was elegant, brilliant, so simple that a child could understand it, so sophisticated that it had taken a woman with specialized knowledge to see it. And he, with all his experience and certainty, had called it madness. Mr. Vaughn, Willa was holding the cabin door open. You'll freeze standing there. He tied his horse to the porch rail and followed her inside. The cabin was cold, maybe 40 degrees, but compared to the bitter air outside, it felt almost warm. A fire burned in the hearth. The little girl sat wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, watching him with huge eyes. Willa poured coffee from a pot on the stove, handed him a tin cup. He wrapped his hands around it gratefully, feeling circulation return to his fingers. They stood there in silence for a long moment. Finally, Silas said, I came to see if you'd survived. I thought I was certain. He stopped, started again. I was wrong. I was completely catastrophically wrong. You were skeptical, Willa said. That's different from being wrong. Skepticism is healthy. I was more than skeptical. I was convinced. I tried to have you declared unfit. I wrote to the territorial governor suggesting someone should remove your children for their own safety. He hadn't meant to say that. The words came out before he could stop them. Willa's expression didn't change. I know. You know. Pastor Whitfield told me. He thought I should be aware. She sipped her coffee. I wasn't angry, Mr. Vaughan. You were acting from concern. Misguided concern, perhaps, but genuine nonetheless. Silas felt something in his chest crack open. This woman, this young widow he'd patronized and pitied and tried to save from her own foolishness, was offering him grace he didn't deserve. How many cattle did you lose? He asked quietly. None. They were in Zeline too fed and watered before the storm hit. I lost 63 head. They scattered in the first night, ran into the draws and gullies. We found them this morning, frozen solid. He said it flatly without emotion. The emotion would come later. Right now he was still processing. Your windbreak, Willa asked. Gone. Completely destroyed by the second day. Planks torn loose and scattered across half the territory. My men spent the storm inside the barn trying to keep it from collapsing. He looked at her. We were safe enough. Stone house, good barn, plenty of supplies, but we lost a year's worth of work, maybe more. I'm sorry. Don't be. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I built that windbreak the same way I've built everything for 30 years. Solid, heavy, strong, trying to stop the wind through sheer force. He gestured toward the window, toward the sculpted snow walls outside. You did something I never imagined possible. You made the wind work for you. My father taught me, Willa said. In Vermont when I was 10 years old. He showed me how wind behaves, how it can be guided instead of stopped. Your husband tried to tell me once about your ideas for planting trees. I dismissed it, told him fence was proven, trees were untested. Silas looked into his coffee. Robert said you were usually right about these things. I told him a wife's intuition wasn't the same as practical experience. Robert wanted to believe you. He wanted to believe the traditional way would work. Willa's voice was gentle. That's not your fault, Mr. Vaughn. Isn't it I reinforced his doubt? I encouraged him to ignore you. He met her eyes. How do you not hate me for that? Because hate takes energy I don't have to spare. She refilled her cup. And because you're here now, which suggests you're capable of changing your mind when presented with evidence. Nathaniel spoke up from where he sat by the fire. Mr. Vaughan, are you going to plant trees now? The directness of childhood. No guile, no subtlety, just honest curiosity. Silas looked at the boy. Yes, I am. Mama can teach you. She knows everything about trees. Not everything, Willa said with a small smile. But enough. Silas set down his coffee cup. Mrs. Thorne, I came here expecting to find... He stopped. I don't know what I expected to find. Bodies, most likely. A tragedy I could have prevented if only you'd listened to me. Instead, I find you safe and warm and proven right in the most spectacular way possible. The trees prove themselves right, Willa corrected. I just understood the principle. That's more than I did. He took a breath. I want to learn everything you know about this, the spacing, the species selection, the geometry of it all. And I want to help spread this knowledge. Every homesteader in Wyoming needs to see what you've done here. That's very kind, but it's not kindness, it's self-interest. Silas gestured toward the door. I just lost 63 cattle and a windbreak that took 3 years to build. If I'd had your trees, I'd have saved the herd. That's not kindness, Mrs. Thorne. That's mathematics. Willa studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, when the snow melts enough to travel, I'll show you how to do it. I'll bring others if you're willing to teach them. I'm willing. They stood in the small cabin, the widow and the rancher, and something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but mutual respect, recognition of competence. The acknowledgement that being wrong about something doesn't make you worthless and being right doesn't make you infallible. Outside, the sun climbed higher and the snow began that subtle transformation that happens when the worst is over and spring, however distant, becomes imaginable again. Silas stayed another hour. He examined the tree placement from inside. The calm zone walked the perimeter as best he could given the deep snow, asked detailed questions about root depth and soil preparation and how Willa had calculated the spacing ratios. She answered everything patiently, drawing diagrams in the snow with a stick when words weren't sufficient. Before he left, he said, "There's something else you should know. I paid $250 to the bank, extended your loan deadline to May 1st. Willa's eyes widened. "Mr. Vaughan, I can't accept." "You can and you will. Consider it payment in advance for the lessons you're going to teach me and every other stubborn fool in this territory." He mounted his horse. "I thought you were wrong, Mrs. Thorne, but I didn't think you deserved to lose your home for being wrong. A gentleman can disagree and still show respect." "Thank you," she said quietly. He tipped his hat and turned his horse toward home, and Willa stood in her circle of calm and watched him go. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "Is he a good man, Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart, he is. Even though he thought you were crazy, especially because he thought I was crazy and helped anyway." The boy thought about this. "That doesn't make sense." "It will when you're older." The next few days were a study in contrasts. Inside the cabin warmth, safety routine gradually returning, Willa and the children settled back into something approximating normal life. They cooked proper meals again, read books. Nathaniel practiced his letters while Beatrice played with her dolls. Outside a transformed world, the snow had stopped falling, but the accumulation was staggering. Drifts 20 feet high in places, paths completely erased, landmarks buried or disguised beyond recognition. But around the cabin, that circle of calm remained. The snow there was manageable, perhaps 10 inches total. Willa could reach the lean-to where the chickens and the cow waited, could access the well, could move freely in a radius of about 15 feet. Beyond that, travel was nearly impossible. On the third day after the storm, another visitor arrived. Willa saw her from a distance, a dark figure moving slowly through the white landscape, following what had once been the road. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Constance Mercer. The older woman was on snowshoes, a pair of rough pine boards strapped to her boots. She carried a walking stick and a pack on her back, and she moved with the steady patience of someone who'd made this journey before. Willa went out to meet her at the edge of the calm zone. "Constance, are you all right? Is everything—" "I'm fine." Constance pulled off her snowshoes and stepped into the shallow snow. "Came to see if you were alive. Looks like you are." "We made it through." Constance looked around at the snow walls, at the cabin sitting peacefully in its protected circle, at the green tips of trees emerging from white ramparts. "I'll be damned," she said softly. "It actually worked." "You doubted." "Of course I doubted. I'm not an idiot." Constance smiled. "But I hoped, and sometimes hope is smarter than certainty." They went inside and Willa made tea, and Constance told her about the storm's aftermath. Several families had suffered major losses. The Hendersons lost their barn. The Pritchards lost half their herd. Old man Callahan had died, went out to check on his animals on the second day and never came back. "Silas Vaughan's been telling everyone about what you did here," Constance said. "About the trees, word spreading fast. He was here 2 days ago." I know. He stopped at my place on his way home. Looked like a man who'd seen God and found out God was a woman with a shovel. Constance grinned. He's organizing a gathering for when travels this year. Wants you to explain your method to anyone who will listen. I told him I would. Good, because you're about to become famous, Willa Thorne, the widow who tamed the Wyoming wind. Constance's expression softened. Your father would be proud. Willa felt her throat tighten. I hope so. They talked for another hour, then Constance strapped her snowshoes back on and headed home. Before she left, she pulled Willa into a brief, fierce hug. You proved them all wrong, she whispered. Every man who ever said women don't understand the land, every fool who ever dismissed your ideas because of who you are instead of what you know. You proved them wrong, and you did it in the most spectacular way possible. After she left, Willa stood in the doorway and looked out at her fortress. Was that what this was about? Proving men wrong? No. It was about survival, about protecting her children, about honoring what her father had taught her and what Robert had failed to learn. But if proving a point had been part of it, if showing Silas Vaughan and the bank manager and every skeptical neighbor that a woman could understand wind and weather and the mathematics of moving air, well, she wasn't going to apologize for that either. December became January. The snow gradually settled and consolidated. Paths began to emerge. Travel became possible again, though difficult. Willa used the time to assess the damage to her shelter belt. Of the 118 trees she'd planted, 94 had survived. The outer ring of cottonwoods had been hit hardest. Only 8 of the original 16 remained standing. The middle ring of ponderosa pine had lost 11 trees. The inner ring of Douglas fir had survived almost intact with only 5 casualties. An 80% survival rate. Willa walked the circles, touching each surviving tree, examining the ones that had fallen. Some had been uprooted, entirely torn from the frozen ground by wind force. Others had snapped at trunk level, the weight of snow and the leverage of wind proving too much for young wood. But the ones that remained stood firm. Their roots had held. Their branches, though bent and snow-laden, showed no signs of permanent damage. They would recover. They would grow. And next winter, they'd be that much stronger. She made notes in her journal about which species had performed the best, which spacing had been most effective, where the gaps in the outer ring had allowed too much wind through. Next time, if she planted for someone else, she'd make adjustments. Closer spacing in the outer ring, a 4th ring perhaps for extra redundancy, different species mixed in areas with different soil or drainage. The design could be improved, made more robust, optimized, but the fundamental principle had been proven sound. On January 15th, Silas Vaughan returned. This time he brought company. Willa saw them coming from a distance, a dozen riders on horseback moving in single file along the partially cleared road. As they drew closer, she recognized faces, ranchers and homesteaders from throughout the county, the Henderson brothers, Marcus Webb from the general store. Even Pastor Whitfield, who rarely left town in winter, they gathered in the area around her cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air, and they stared at what she'd built. Silas dismounted and approached. Mrs. Thorne, I hope you don't mind the crowd. Word spread about what happened here. These men wanted to see for themselves. They're welcome, Willa said. Then raising her voice so everyone could hear, You're all welcome. Come inside where it's warm and I'll explain how this works. The cabin was too small for everyone, so they took turns. Willa explained the principles to groups of 3 or 4 at a time, while the others waited outside, examining the trees, measuring the spacing, discussing what they saw. She drew diagrams, explained the mathematics of wind resistance and turbulent flow, described how to select species and prepare soil and calculate spacing ratios. Some understood immediately. Others needed multiple explanations. A few remained skeptical, though their skepticism was now tempered with grudging respect. How much did this cost you? asked Thomas Henderson, a practical man with a practical question. About $300 total. That includes hiring help, buying burlap for root protection, and purchasing some tools. If you do the work yourself and source the trees from public land, you could do it for under 100. How long until they're fully effective? They're already effective, you can see that, but they'll reach full maturity in 15 to 20 years. Each year they'll provide more protection than the year before. What if we can't wait 20 years? Plant them as large as you can transplant successfully. 4 to 5 feet tall is ideal. They'll establish faster. She paused. But even small trees work, as you've seen. The key is density and proper spacing, not size. Marcus Webb spoke up. Mrs. Thorne, I don't mean offense, but I have to ask. Is this something anyone can do, or does it require special knowledge? It was a fair question, and the answer mattered. Anyone can do it, Willa said firmly. It requires careful planning and hard work, but not special knowledge beyond what I can teach you in an afternoon. The principles are simple. Understanding why they work requires some education, but applying them doesn't. Will you help us? This from a young homesteader named Peter Walsh, barely 20, newly married, struggling to establish his claim. Not just explain it, but actually help design the plantings we could pay. I don't want payment, Willa interrupted. What I want is for people to survive winters. What I want is for fewer families to lose everything because they didn't have protection. You want my help? You have it. Freely given. There was a long silence. Then Silas Vaughan said quietly, the Territorial Agricultural Commission should hire you. Official consultant, make this your job. I have a job, I'm a homesteader. Then let them pay you to teach other homesteaders. $75 a year, maybe more. Travel stipend for visiting different properties. It would help with your debt, give you steady income, and spread this knowledge across Wyoming. Willa looked at him, looked at the dozen men crowded into and around her small cabin, looked at Nathaniel, who was watching her with those serious gray eyes. All right, she said, I'll do it. Over the next 6 weeks, Willa became something she'd never imagined being: a teacher, an expert, a consultant sought after for her knowledge. She visited 14 properties, helping families design their own shelter belts. She adjusted plans for different terrain, different exposure, different resources. She taught the principles over and over until she could recite them in her sleep. And everywhere she went, she saw the same thing: respect. Not because she was a widow to be pitied or a woman to be humored, but because she knew things they needed to know. The Territorial Commission did hire her, $75 a year plus expenses. It wasn't a fortune, but combined with what she could make from cattle sales, it was enough to pay the bank debt and have something left over. On March 1st, she rode into town and paid off her loan in full. Mr. Garrett, the bank manager, counted the money with his usual precision. $636. The account is settled, Mrs. Thorne. He made a note in his ledger. I confess I didn't expect to see you again. Neither did I, Willa said honestly. But here we are. Indeed. He closed the ledger. For what it's worth, I'm glad you proved me wrong. It seemed everyone was glad to have been proven wrong, as if her success somehow reflected well on them for having doubted her. Willa didn't mind. She'd take vindication in whatever form it came. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, but it arrived. The snow melted, the ground thawed, green things began to push through brown earth, and around Willa's cabin the trees that had survived winter began to leaf out. The Douglas firs put on new growth at their tips. The ponderosa pines budded. Even the battered cottonwoods showed signs of recovery. She planted 24 new trees to replace the ones that had died, adjusting the pattern to account for lessons learned. Nathaniel helped as he always had, but now he understood not just what they were doing, but why. He could calculate spacing, identify species, explain to his little sister how wind behaves when it encounters resistance. One evening in late April, as the sun set golden over the prairie, Silas Vaughan came calling one last time. He found Willa in her garden planting potatoes. "Mrs. Thorne, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Vaughan. What can I do for you?" "I wanted you to see something." He handed her a newspaper, the Cheyenne Daily Leader. Page 3. She wiped the dirt from her hands and opened the paper, found the article he meant. "Wind-breaking trees revolutionary method saves widow's homestead." It was a long piece detailing the storm, the trees, the principle behind the design. It quoted Silas extensively. It mentioned the Territorial Agricultural Commission's decision to hire her as a consultant. And it called her work a revolution in plains agriculture that may change how we approach winter survival. Willa read it twice, then looked up at Silas. "You did this." "I talked to the reporter, yes, but you did the work. You proved the concept." He gestured at the trees surrounding her cabin. "That fortress you built, it's going to save lives, not just yours. Hundreds of lives, maybe thousands if the idea spreads the way I think it will. I just wanted to protect my children." The best revolutions start that way. Personal need turned into universal solution. Silas tipped his hat. "I'll let you get back to your planting. I just wanted you to know that what you did here matters. Beyond this property, beyond this winter, it matters." After he left, Willa sat on her porch steps and watched the sun finish setting. The trees cast long shadows across the ground, shadows that would grow longer each year as the trees grew taller, shadows that would shelter this ground, this cabin, these children for decades to come. She thought about her father who taught her to see the invisible architecture of wind. She thought about Robert who died because he couldn't learn the lesson she tried to teach him. She thought about the storm and the 3 days of terror and the moment she'd opened the door to find her fortress standing. And she thought about the future, about other widows, other homesteaders, other families who would plant these trees and survive winters that would have killed them otherwise. A legacy. That's what this was becoming, not just survival, but legacy. The newspaper article was picked up by other papers. The story spread. By summer, Willa had received letters from homesteaders as far away as the Dakotas and Montana asking for advice. She answered every letter, drew diagrams, explained principles, encouraged experimentation and adaptation to local conditions. In July, a photographer from Harper's Weekly arrived to take pictures of her shelter belt for a feature story. He spent 3 days photographing the trees from every angle, interviewing Willa about her methods, talking to neighbors about the storm. The article ran in September with a full-page illustration, Willa standing in front of her cabin, surrounded by her rings of trees under the headline, "The Widow's Fortress, How One Woman's Wisdom Defeated the Wyoming Wind." Constance Mercer bought 6 copies and distributed them around town with considerable satisfaction. "Every man who doubted you should have to look at this every morning," she declared. But Willa noticed something interesting. The men who doubted her most weren't resentful of her success. They were grateful for it, because her success meant they could succeed too. Her survival showed them a path forward. Silas Vaughan became her most vocal advocate. He planted his own shelter belt that spring following her design exactly and spent the rest of the year telling anyone who'd listen about the revolution in wind management. By the time winter returned in late 1887, 47 properties in the county had planted shelter belts. Some were complete, some were still in progress, but all of them followed the basic principles Willa had proven. And when the first major storm of that second winter hit, in December, those families sheltered behind walls of living wood and snow, and they survived. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was harsh, but it wasn't devastating. Not for those who'd learned the lesson, not for those who'd planted trees. Years passed. The trees grew. Willa's children grew with them. Nathaniel became fascinated with botany and soil science. At 15, he was accepted to the Territorial Agricultural College on a scholarship funded by ranchers who'd benefited from his mother's teachings. He would later become a professor of forestry, carrying forward the principles his mother had proven. Beatrice grew into a sharp-minded young woman who inherited her mother's gift for seeing systems and patterns. She started a business selling tree saplings specifically for shelter belt planting and made more money in 3 years than her mother had made in 10. She married a kind man who respected her intelligence, and together they raised 4 daughters who all learned to plant trees before they learned to sew. And Willa herself became something of a legend, the widow who knew the wind, the woman who made winter work for her. She never remarried. There were offers, but she declined them all. She was content with her children, her trees, her work. The Territorial Commission expanded her role. She traveled extensively, consulting on shelter belt designs across Wyoming and into neighboring territories. She wrote articles for agricultural journals. She testified before the territorial legislature about the importance of scientific land management. In 1895, the University of Wyoming awarded her an honorary degree in forestry, the first woman to receive such recognition from that institution. The ceremony was held outdoors under an open sky, and Willa stood in her black academic gown and thought about her father, who would have been so proud. In 1910, at the age of 56, she published a book, Principles of Wind Management for Agricultural Protection. It became required reading for forestry students across the West. The book was dedicated to my father Jonas Reed, who taught me to see the wind, and to my husband Robert Thorne, who taught me the cost of ignoring it. And through it all, the trees she'd planted in the desperate autumn of 1886 continued to grow. By 1920, they were 60 feet tall. Their roots went down 30 feet or more. Their branches interlocked into a living wall that could withstand any storm the Wyoming wind could conjure. The cabin still stood at the center, small and humble, dwarfed now by the forest that protected it. Willa lived there until 1941, when she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. Her children were with her. Her grandchildren played in the next room. And outside the tree she'd planted 55 years earlier stood in their patient circles, still doing the work she'd designed them to do. At her funeral, Silas Voyan's grandson, the old rancher himself, having passed away a decade prior, stood up to speak. My grandfather told me a story once, he said, about a widow who taught him that being wrong doesn't make you foolish and being certain doesn't make you wise. He said that Willa Thorne saved his life by teaching him to listen. Not just to hear, but to listen, to consider that someone else might know something he didn't, to change his mind when presented with evidence. He paused, looking out at the crowd that had gathered, homesteaders and ranchers, professors and students, people who'd known Willa personally and people who only knew her legend. She didn't just plant trees, he said, she planted an idea, and ideas like trees grow. In 1956, 70 years after the widow planted her first sapling, a young man named Jonas Thorne stood in the shadow of those trees. He was Nathaniel's son, Willa's grandson, named for the Vermont forester who had started it all 3 generations back. Jonas was a district ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, 28 years old, educated and ambitious, and deeply aware of the legacy he'd inherited. He'd driven from Laramie to visit the old homestead, now preserved as a historical site. The cabin had been maintained, the property protected, the trees catalogued and studied. Forestry students came here on field trips. Photographers came to capture the massive ancient trees. Families came to picnic in the calm zone that still after 7 decades remained relatively snow-free in winter. He stood in the center of the rings, a man in the prime of life, surrounded by trees that were older than his parents, planted by a grandmother he'd barely known, and he felt the weight of connection across time. These trees had saved his grandmother's life. That survival had allowed his father to be born, to grow up, to have children of his own. Every person in Jonas's family, everyone who would come after that terrible winter of 1886 existed because a widow had refused to give up. Because she'd understood something about wind that others hadn't, because she'd been willing to risk everything on a principle. He walked to the bronze plaque that had been installed in 1942, shortly after Willa's death. Read the inscription he'd read a dozen times before, but which never failed to move him. The Thorn Shelter Belt, established 1886. Pioneer Willa Thorne, 1854 to 1941, proved that understanding nature's principles is more powerful than defying them. Her scientific approach to wind management revolutionized Great Plains agriculture and saved countless lives. She didn't conquer winter, she taught winter to protect her. Jonas reached into his pack and withdrew a small sapling, Douglas fir, 3 feet tall, root ball wrapped in burlap, just as his grandmother would have done. He'd brought it from the ranger station nursery specifically for this purpose. He walked to the northern edge of the inner ring, found a gap where an old tree had finally died the previous year, and began to dig. The work was familiar, meditative, a connection to something larger than himself. The soil was rich here, decades of leaf fall and root decay, creating the kind of loam his grandmother had dreamed of when she'd first mixed creek soil with prairie clay. He dug carefully, respectfully, thinking about the hands that had dug the original holes 70 years before. As he settled the sapling into the hole and backfilled with rich soil, Jonas thought about continuity, about knowledge passed down, about how one person's desperate gamble could become another generation's standard practice. His grandmother had planted in fear and hope. He planted in gratitude and remembrance. When the sapling was secure, watered, and firmly tamped, Jonas stood back and looked at what he'd done. One small tree among giants. But it would grow. In 70 years, it would be as tall as the others, providing shade and shelter, breaking wind into harmless eddies, doing the patient work that trees do. He picked up his spade and walked back toward his truck, his boots leaving clear prints in the soft earth of the calm zone. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror at the massive circle of green that marked where a widow had once made a stand against impossible odds. The afternoon sun painted everything golden. The wind, always the wind on these plains, whispered through the branches, a sound like breathing, like the earth itself inhaling and exhaling in the patient rhythm of seasons. And high above in the clear Wyoming sky, a hawk circled lazily, riding currents that had been tamed by the patient architecture of living wood. The fortress stood 70 years after its creation, decades after its builder's death. Through countless storms and seasons, through the transformation of territory into state, through wars and depressions and all the changes that time brings. It stood and it would stand for decades more, a monument to the simple truth that understanding beats force, that working with nature is wiser than fighting it, and that one person with courage and knowledge can change the world, not through conquest, not through domination, but through the quiet persistence of planting trees in the face of doubt and trusting that roots once established hold firm against any storm. The wind whispered through the branches. The tree stood. The fortress endured. And somewhere in the spaces between the green and growing things, in the calm zone where snow fell softly and wind lost its rage, the spirit of a woman who had understood the wind better than anyone thought possible looked out at what she'd created and knew that it was good, that it would last, that it mattered. The sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the snow-covered peaks in the distance with shades of rose and gold. Shadows lengthened across the ground. Birds settled into the branches for the night. The temperature dropped as it always did when the sun disappeared. But in the center of the thorn shelter belt, in the calm zone that had been created by design and maintained by nature, the air remained still, protected, safe. Just as Willa Thorne had promised it would be 70 winters ago, when she'd planted the first small tree and bet her life and her children's lives on a principle she'd learned from her father in the Green Mountains of Vermont. She'd been right. The trees had worked, and they were working still.